How do you actually strengthen your rotator cuff? There are thousands and thousands of videos explaining how you can best strengthen your rotator cuff. Now, today I am here to talk about the basics of rotator cuff strengthening, which you'll quickly find out is not so basic. This is imperative that you understand exactly what the rotator cuff is, what it does, and how to actually activate those muscles in order to strengthen it. Without getting into too much of the anatomy, that will be at a different point. We're going to talk a little bit about the 4 muscles of the rotator cuff, okay? So you have 1 muscle in the front, 1 up top, and 2 in the back, okay? So you have your subscapularis, which is in the front, you have your supraspinatus, which is up top, then you have your infraspinatus and your teres minor in the back. So that's what creates the cuff, okay? That co-contraction, so the contraction of all 4 of those muscles, is the thing that kind of sucks the humeral head, the arm bone, into the socket. That's what gives it the stability. Those fibers of the rotator cuff, the tendons, are continuous with the capsule of the joint. That really matters because it's what creates that stability for your arm to be able to move overhead. If you don't activate those muscles before you move the rest of your shoulder, you're not going to be able to actually stabilize your shoulder effectively. That's why this is so important. These exercises may seem super basic, but if you can't do them, it's a sign that you're taking the next step when you shouldn't be, okay? You need to be able to master these basics before you move on to something that's more complex strengthening. So before you do any type of pulling motion, before you do any type of pushing motion, before you do any type of pressing motion, you need to be able to activate your rotator cuff. You need to be able to activate and isolate these 4 muscles in order to be able to actually do anything functional with your shoulder. The actions that we're going to talk about of the rotator cuff will be 4 different movements. We're going to talk about flexion, abduction, external rotation, and internal rotation, okay? I'm gonna go over what all of these look like and what you should do to activate these muscles. Doing these exercises as a warm-up is a really great way to make sure you're telling your brain, hey, I need to activate this entire cuff as I'm doing any type of shoulder movement in order to get the most out of your workout. And it's also a really great way to rehab your shoulder. So you first need to be able to do these 4 exercises in order to be able to move on to something more complex. These are 4 exercises that I give to people, but it's not necessarily the only thing you can do. What I'm saying is that it's a really effective thing that you can do, that you can layer into your program. The thing though is that before you move on to something more complex, you have to be able to isolate and activate these muscles. Exercise number 1 is going to be external rotation. So you're going to have your elbow bent and you're going to turn your arm out to the side and then you're going to come back to center. So external rotation at the shoulder is when the bicep is pointing forward and then you're turning it so it's coming out to the side, okay? This may seem really basic, but if you have a rotator cuff issue, this won't be very basic, okay? The thing that you really need to focus on is the position that your shoulder is in. So if your shoulder is too far forward and you start doing this, you're not actually going to be activating the right muscles and you're not going to be reinforcing the best movement pattern. You need to make sure you pull your shoulder back. You're not pinching your shoulders back. You're just pulling that humeral head back just slightly, keeping your elbow in by your side and coming out to the side just like this, okay? Very common compensations that I see is people will start to kind of straighten their elbow and bring their elbow away from them. We want to be really specific about your bicep is pointing forward and then it's coming out to the side, okay? The other thing that I see is that people's spine starts going with them. They start going like this and then they kind of start moving their whole body. So you really want to make sure that you're just isolating just that area. That's going to really target that infraspinatus and the teres minor and a little bit of that supraspinatus as well. Exercise number 2 is flexion. So typically when we think about flexion, we think about bringing that arm overhead. What I like to start with first is making sure that you're activating that right musculature. By bending your elbow, you're decreasing the demand on the shoulder. So then what you're doing is you can focus on the movement as opposed to just overcoming some of that weight. To start, I like to do this flexion just up to 90 degrees because then it's also making sure that I'm using the appropriate muscles as well. Okay, so the reason why I start with external rotation first is because The thing that I want you to be focused on is making sure that you're in this external rotation range of motion. So sometimes when someone's palm is down, then when they go to lift their arm overhead, their shoulder is turning in too much. So by enforcing this motion of my bicep is pointing up, I'm coming just up to shoulder height, and then I'm gonna come back down, okay? So just up to shoulder height and come back down. This same principle applies when I'm here, where I need to make sure that that shoulder isn't forward. So I need to pull that back to a neutral position, come up, and then come down. So I'm just coming up and down just like this, okay? So as I'm doing this, I'm thinking about making sure that that bicep stays pointing up the entire time. For shoulder abduction, this one gets complicated as well, okay? So we're gonna layer onto that idea of external rotation. My bicep is going to be pointing forward. I'm going to keep my elbow bent because again, it's going to decrease the amount of stress on that shoulder so I can just focus on activating that muscle. Now, I'm going to bring my elbow out to the side and then I'm going to come back down. I'm keeping my palm up because it's going to be easier to make sure that I'm focusing on keeping that bicep pointing forward. What happens sometimes is someone's palm is down is that they kind of start turning their arm in, they kind of start dropping that down. I really want to make sure that I'm maintaining that neutral position of my shoulder so my bicep is pointing forward. So what happens sometimes is that when someone goes to lift their arm up, their wrist drops and their elbow comes up. You want to make sure that you're keeping that in line that entire time. The same principle applies where I need to make sure that I keep that part of my shoulder back as I bring that arm out to the side. So I'm not bringing it forward, I'm just bringing it out to the side, just like this. The other thing is that when someone has had a history of a rotator cuff issue, they do this. So you see how I'm starting to lift up, I'm lifting my shoulder up toward my ear to bring that arm overhead. They'll start like this and they'll slowly start bringing their shoulder up. You want to keep this shoulder down the entire time. So that shoulder blade has to stay down. The way I describe it is like you need to think about your elbow moving out. It's like you're pushing it out as much as you can as you bring it up. So it's like you need to think about it, it's like I'm pulling your arm away from you as you bring that arm up, okay? So that's abduction. Then finally, we move into internal rotation. This one can be very complicated for people if you have an issue with this. So again, I like to start with this elbow bent. Again, my shoulder is in this position where it's on the side of my rib cage, so it's not rolled forward. Elbow is bent. I'm going to bring this arm back. And now as I bring this arm back, what happens a lot of times is that shoulder dips forward. I need to try to keep that pulled back. And then I'm going to slightly unbend my elbow and bring my hand behind me. Okay, so I'm starting with my arm by my side. I'm extending my shoulder and then I'm turning that bicep in. So I'm turning that bicep in to bring my hand behind me. Okay, so from the front, I'm extending my shoulder and then you see how I have to bring my elbow out to the side just slightly in order to turn this arm in and come behind me. This one, do not force this motion, okay? So what happens is sometimes people will go like this, you know, they'll kind of just really try to round and compensate. If you need to start, just bring this arm back like this and maybe start turning that bicep in just slightly. So you're just kind of grooving it in that position. So it'd be like this, where you're just like kind of coming to your back pocket. You're not necessarily bringing your hand behind you. Okay, so the goal isn't to necessarily just force this behind you. You want to make sure that you're extending your shoulder and slightly turning in. With these 4 different exercises, what I suggest is first start without using any weight. Just find that movement pattern. Teach your brain, okay, this is how I activate this rotator cuff. I would start with doing something like 2 sets of 10. You can work up to 3 sets of 10, but be really specific about how you're moving, right? This can feel incredibly tedious because it doesn't really feel like you're doing that much, but what you're doing is you're reinforcing a movement pattern. You're telling your brain, you need to activate these muscles when you start to do any type of shoulder movement. So that's what's going to be really important, is making sure that you're reinforcing a good pattern. So be really specific about how you're going about doing these. Then from there, then you can go up to doing 3 sets of 10, and then eventually then you can add weight for all these, holding a dumbbell. And then these are just the basics. From there, you can start to add in a little bit more strength. But what you first need to make sure is that you have enough of that range of motion. So if you can't bring your bicep all the way out to the side, if you're kind of stuck like this, as opposed to being like this, then that's a good indication that you need to stick with that exercise. So you need full range of motion before you start to strengthen anymore. Give this a try, and make sure to share this with your friends. I'm sure you know someone who has rotator cuff issues, so they would definitely benefit from this. Also, compare left and right sides, because it can be a really good indication of what side is moving pretty well, what side needs a little bit of work. Make sure to like and share this on all of our social media platforms. This really helps us to be able to help other people, so we really appreciate your sharing.